Eric's not muted. Excellent. There we go. Looks like the webinar has started. All right, yeah, we're starting to see some people come in. Welcome, everybody. We are just waiting for my colleague Eric to get us up and running on Facebook and LinkedIn. I'm sure many of you know the drill by now. So give us just a moment here while we get people into the webinar. Okay. Great. Oh, actually, that was faster than expected. It looks like we are now streaming on social media, so that means we can get going. So, hey, everybody, this is Jeremy with the Next Big Idea Club, and I'm here with Bo Seo. He is the author of Good Arguments, How Debate Teaches Us to Listen and Be Heard. It's one of our selections for this season. So, Bo, welcome to the Next Big Idea Club.
Jeremy, thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure.
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. Yeah. So we'll first, tell us where you're joining us from today.
I am calling in from Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Oh, very cool. Okay, so that's where you're living these days?
Yeah, that's right. So I'm at the law school at Harvard. It's exam season, actually.
Oh, man.
So it's good to actually talk about something I know.
That's right. Well, yeah, I'm happy to provide you with a little bit of relief. Yeah, I actually, I just went back to school myself. I started a master's program at the University of Denver, and I just wrapped up exams. And so it's nice to be using my brain in a way that does not entail a tremendous amount of stress.
That's good. Yeah, it's good to be here.
Yes, absolutely. So Bo, before we get started, I wanted to tell you that your book has really been resonating with our audience. In fact, we had one longtime member of the club, Lisa W. She said, "This is my favorite selection in my almost 5 years with the Next Big Idea Club. I've learned from all the selections, but this one has the most heart. Bravo, Bo." So, I mean, thank you for writing the book. I mean, we're really excited to have you in the club.
Well, let me say, Jeremy, thanks back to Lisa and to the rest of your membership as well. I mean, it means a huge amount as a first-time author to have the vote of confidence that you've provided. But the best part of it has been the access to this group of really engaged readers and whose influence on the world is really outsized, I think, and does have a role in shaping trends, but also in the conversations that it sparked in my inbox, and where I've toured the book. So I want to thank you for that, and I want to thank the group, and I look forward to continuing that conversation today.
Excellent. No, I mean, we're so happy to have you, and that's a great reminder, Bo, that for everyone watching this, whether it's on Zoom or via Facebook or LinkedIn, if you have any questions or comments as we go, feel free to let us know. In Zoom, you can drop them in the chat box or using the Q&A function, or leave a comment on Facebook or LinkedIn, and then we'll see if we can integrate some of your thoughts into our conversation, because I do want this to be a two-way street. So to get started, Bo, could you just tell us a little bit more about, what first inspired this book? How did you even first get the thought, what, I should write about this stuff?
It's a great question. I had two moments in which I could have written the book. So the first is in January 2016, when I won the World Universities Debate Championships. This is a tournament that attracts 500 of the best teams in the world. There's one winner. I was, so used to being in the 499 that it was like a part of my identity. And this was a big moment for me, and the readers of the book would recognize that I started debating in part because I moved from South Korea to Australia when I was a kid and I didn't speak English. And I found that debate was the only place where when one person spoke, no one else did. It was the only place where I could really be heard, and heard in the context of expressing my differences in a full and frank way. So it was a hugely important activity in my life. It was an activity where I found my voice, and that was sort of the culmination of that that competition. And I'd been coaching debate. I'd been the coach of the Harvard debate team for some time then, and I'd coached the Australians, and And I thought there might be room for a kind of a guide to distill what I had learned and to really kind of evangelize for this activity. So that was the first stroke of inspiration.
Mm-hmm.
But then the thing that made the process much longer and much more complicated was what happened a few months after that win, which was the presidential cycle between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, where, and I'd been tasked by a publication to write about those debates, and I couldn't come up with something on the spot because the debates became not only a symbol for the polarization that had kind of riven this country, but it also became a tool for those divisions to become more intractable, more ugly, more painful. And I started to think that this activity that, you know, I'd been all up on contained these different shades. And it took me those years of traveling around, I worked as a newspaper reporter, of reporting on politics, to think through what the uses and limits of debate are, and also just to grow up a little bit, which helps. And
always, yeah.
And so I think the book that results, you know, I hope what your reader said is true, that there's a bit of heart in there. There's uncertainties. There's a story of growth, and so it was that sense of believing firmly in what debate can do, but also seeing its limits that made me want to write this book.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's such an interesting trajectory. And I'm also glad that you brought up this now infamous series of debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, because I think that is emblematic of the fact that everything feels very contentious in the United States right now. Where it almost feels like both around our dinner tables and on social media, there's almost this climate of constant arguing, or at least it feels that way sometimes. And so my question for you is, especially coming at this from a not completely US-centric perspective, you know, having spent so much time living in Australia, for example, having traveled around the world for debate, is there a difference in how some of your ideas are being received in different parts of the world, in different countries, or does everyone seem to be experiencing this same sense of, man, everyone's arguing all the time?
It's such a great question. I think the first thing to note is there are lots of similarities, and one part of that is, and one of the key points that I wanted to make with the book is that it's not a bad thing that there are all these disagreements, and that those disagreements are products in part of the fact that we're trying to manage really diverse societies in which more people have had the freedom to speak than ever before, and still try to better manage our disagreements. So that's a kind of a commonality across certainly most of the places I've been to, and it is in some ways the key challenge for democratic societies for our time in particular. So I think there are some similarities. I think the one little nuance maybe that I've noticed living in the United States is there was a time, possibly because of the presidential elections, when things felt very existential. And there was also a time when I think we were taking our cues in our private lives a lot more from the public discourse, whether that be political ones or the news media, right? So as far out as the discussions on Fox and MSNBC can be, I sort of noticed we were starting to take our cues from that. That some of those norms of engagement or thinking about people who disagree fed into the day-to-day more so than I saw in some other countries. And I think that was a real problem because, you know, when you recognize, I mean, I think it's a great gift that most of us are not public figures, right? Because
Right.
we can, because, people, there is a richness that we're allowed in our living room, in our kitchen table, that we may not be able to if we have 5 brand consultants telling us about how one statement we're making is consistent with what we said in the past and so on. And so one of the things that I wanted to advocate in the US in particular is reclaiming that space, that sense of the private, where we could be wrong, and ask for grace of people who usually love us and who are committed to living with us, where we can be inconsistent, where we can be playful, and probably, and to overstep and to ask for grace in a way that's only okay because they will need to ask grace of us too. So it's that kind of discussion that I think may be especially needed here than in some other places.
I think that's beautifully said. And I think it really speaks to Lisa's comment earlier about how much heart is in this book. Like, I think there, and this might be a wrong, incorrect stereotype here, Bo. You can correct me if so, but I suspect that there are a number of world champion debaters that would write a book without necessarily a focus on things like play and grace and inconsistency. In some ways, these things feel a little bit antithetical to what could be considered like the perfect way to debate, or the perfect way to argue. And so I really love that you have this really deep attention to detail on the nuts and bolts of debate, but also this focus on just the realities of being human and living with people that you disagree with. Does that feel like something that you actively need to balance, or has that always just kind of come naturally to you?
I really appreciate that, Jeremy. It's always something you need to balance, right? And if you talk to former romantic partners of mine,
let's get them on the phone.
they might talk about a different side of disagreeing. But and I didn't want to shy away from that in the book, because there is an element of debate and disagreeing which is contest. And it's competitive and it's passionate and it's spectacular in the sense of it's a spectacle. And I didn't want to write the kind of book where we were all angels sitting around excising big parts of what I think it means to be human, what it means to be social beings, which is those things come into it. It's a question of how do we manage it? How do we make sure it's a force for good rather than bad, of connection rather than division? So I think that management has to always happen. And in terms of how I come to the issue personally, that vulnerability, I think, was always a part of it for me. One question I often get is what's a good argument, right? That's the name of the
of course.
And people will say, or and people give suggestions. I wanted to be able to say, it's one in which you learn an enormous amount, or you fundamentally change your worldview, or you develop this lasting connection. And I believe debate can do all of those things. But the answer I settled on is a good argument is one in which both sides walk away feeling as though they would do that again, because that's all it takes for the conversation to continue. And the reason why I came to that, and the reason why the vulnerability is always a part of it for me, is when I started debate and I started talking frankly about the differences I felt between myself and my peers as an immigrant to a new place, the thing that was most important for me was that I be able to remain in conversation, that I wasn't just taking instructions, I wasn't just passing by, avoiding notice. And I've been through that experience many times. I feel like, I've been through it going into a new workplace as the most junior person, in that political moment where everything feels existential. It's easier just to kind of skate by, and so that sense, we're going to do it a conversation at a time, by showing ourselves, taking those leaps of faith. I think that was always a part of it for me, and it was a big thing that limited those adversarial instincts, that you wanted to compete fiercely, but it was of no use if that was going to be the end of the connection or the conversation.
Right. No, I think that makes total sense. And once again, is beautifully said. It's almost like you're a world champion at speaking your mind or something. It's crazy. I did want to get into some of the questions that our members have submitted for you, Bo. So for example, Tony Z asks, how can we get people into a good argument when the ego gets in their way? And I feel like that's something that we can probe a little bit when it comes to someone else's ego getting in the way, and also our own, right? Like even having finished your book, when I'm in a debate with someone about something completely trivial, even when I start to realize like, oh crap, I think I'm wrong, there's no way I'm going to admit that. Like my ego, even when I know it shouldn't, my ego still kicks in. It's like, no, you've got to stand your ground on this, So yeah, how can we get better at managing our own ego and those of others?
It's a really deep question. I'll give you a kind of a theoretical answer, and I'll give you two practical suggestions. So the theoretical answer is, and this came up in my conversation with Adam Grant, actually, and it's an insight he had I've been thinking about since. So it's been weeks. So he says, look, you're going to have a hard time because making the case for good arguments, because everybody is very sensitive to the loss that good argument, or that any argument can entail. That's loss of face, loss of pride, loss of your ideas. And hearing your question just now, it was Tony, right?
Yes, Tony Z.
Hearing Tony's question just now makes me think maybe pride is quite proximate to loss. Right. So we're proud in part because of an awareness we might lose something here. Right. So there's something, they seem like neighboring ideas almost. And one of the things Adam suggested is to say, so people are more sensitive to the loss that arguments might have than to the potential gains, right? So the new ideas and so on, and deeper connections that I was talking about earlier. And so he was suggesting maybe reframing the avoidance of arguments as a kind of loss unto itself. So standing still, stasis, is a kind of loss, right? And there are some areas like in business where this is a familiar concept. So creative destruction, right? If you're not innovating and you're staying still, you're kind of falling behind. I'm sure Usain Bolt feels that way, but we don't really feel that in arguments. So one thing I'm thinking about, I'd be interested to hear people's thoughts about, is how do we frame the avoidance of argument, rooted in ego, rooted in pride, as a kind of loss too. Right. So that's the puzzle that I'm thinking about. In terms of more practically what debate does about it, I'd say two things. One is debate is just one mode of engagement, one mode of disagreement even. And one of the things that I see when I still sometimes volunteer to hear local students is they debate takes about an hour. And in that hour, some of these are elementary school kids, they are absolutely going at it, right? Hammer and tongs, arguing, passionate, red faces, whole thing. But then when it ends, you'll hear on the bus home, one kid turn to another and say, you had a good argument there. And what that makes me think is, it's not that the ego goes away, but that we make room for different sides of us in different ways of engaging with one another. So when we are debating, we might be competing. We're just seeing how our ideas butt up against one another. But then that switch to saying, now we're doing something else. We're kind of reflecting on what just happened. We're now collaborating. We're looking at some solutions that might come out of that exchange.
Mhm.
Being able to make that switch, I think, is critical. So saying the ego or pride is not attached to just one mode of engagement. And this, again, is about the private sphere, right? Like,
Mhm.
how can you just argue when 2 hours from now, you're going to have to take out the trash. You're going to have to sort the trash
Mhm.
together. You're going to have to pick up the kids. And so keeping room for those different modes of engagement, I think can be helpful.
Mhm.
The other thing that debate encourages us to do is to be able to argue the other side sometimes better than they can. So there are some exercises that I go through called the side switch exercises, where before presenting your own case, after being fully convinced of it, you turn to a fresh sheet of paper and you try and come up with the best arguments for the other side, or you return to your case as though through the eyes of an opponent
Mhm.
and poke as many holes as you can, essentially, in what you have to say. And that mode of de-selfing for a second, or
Mhm.
stepping outside of your perspective, I think helps you see the four corners of your perspective a little bit, right?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
say it's limited. You don't see everything.
Mhm.
And I think even those kinds of exercises, even if you don't see the point of it, actually going through it does decenter things and change your perspective a little bit. And I think that helped me at least keep the ego in check.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And I think those side switch exercises, actively choosing to take the perspective of the other person, I think it helps teach us, even subconsciously, that we are not our opinions. Like those are not necessarily all the same thing. And I think because ultimately it seems to me that people, as Adam, was pointing out, the reason why so many people are reluctant to say I'm wrong is because, well, even that framing of I'm wrong, it's not my ideas are wrong, it's that I myself am wrong.
Yeah.
And I think when you can sort of decouple the person from their ideas, suddenly it becomes a little bit easier to admit fault, or say you had a good argument there, because there isn't as much loss of face involved, right?
I like that so much. And, in debate, you're assigned a position,
Mm.
right? And another way of saying that is it could have just as been the other way. And
Right,
in
right.
debate, that's highly stylized.
Mhm.
Obviously, it's you literally flip a coin or you draw a name from a hat. But I sometimes think many of the opinions we arrive at have that element of randomness too, right?
Mm.
Why was it that you were born to these parents rather than those parents, or you were born in this country rather than that country, in this part of this country rather than that part? Um and that's not a reason to be nihilistic or to say it doesn't matter what we think. It's just to say there's a lot of randomness in how we arrive at a position. And given
Mm.
that's always going to be the case, maybe the best thing we can do is to use that as a reason to exercise some humility, to check out the other paths that
Yes.
we could have taken, to view the other side as having arrived at the positions they arrived at, not through some evil intent often or anything like that, but through the same channels and winding pathways through which we arrive at our views. I think that's a helpful switch. And I think it's similar to what you're just describing there.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I've even thought about this in relation to sports teams,
Yeah.
because as a now a Massachusetts resident, you may be able to relate to my love of the Boston Red Sox.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, my mom is from Massachusetts, and so
Oh,
growing up,
terrific.
I was a huge Red Sox fan. And I do remember at some point I realized I'm like, it's a little absurd that I believe that the Red Sox are just like obviously the best team in baseball, but but of course it took me some time to be like, well, I probably wouldn't think that had I not been born to, these two parents. But yeah, I think it's an idea that has wide applicability. I did want to segue into a slightly different part of your book, Bo, where you mentioned this study conducted that that showed that the average household of those surveyed had 217 arguments related to dishwashing every year, or about 18 arguments per month. And I think a lot of people watching this can relate to this phenomenon, where especially with the people that we live with, there is this tendency to argue over just dumb stuff that just doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. So why does this happen?
I think it happens for a number of reasons. But one of them, as you say, is carelessness, right? When we know we're about to enter into a discussion about something very serious, like where we send the kids to school, or what we do with older parents, right, in their elderly age, we come to it with some amount of preparation, and even expectation that there will be a disagreement at all, right? As opposed to in this chapter about relationships, I explain how each of these kind of reasons why we go wrong, the assumption that the other side will agree with us, the thought that this is not a big deal given the gravity of what we've undertaken, which is to share most of our lives together, which is a big deal. I explained how those are actually kind of lovely reasons, right? The view that, and in some ways, it's probably the right view of dishes that they're not a big deal, right? It's probably right that you come to know your partner as intimately sometimes as you know yourself. That's an amazing idea, but it leads to all these problems in the realm of argument and disagreement. And maybe one other piece to add there is the magic of sharing so much of our lives with one another is there's a lot of things we could disagree about. And so I think probably there's this, we walk a bit of a tightrope sometimes. And then if you can imagine just the pools of potential lava on the side that you could be arguing about. And it's very easy to slip off that. And something as small as dishwashing or laundry can make that move. And one of the more practical suggestions that I make in the book is to say, especially when there's this background pool of potential disagreements and dangers that could be triggered, to explicitly name what the disagreement is about. So every disagreement, in my view, should start with some amount of agreement. And that's primarily agreement about what the disagreement is actually about. Are we really talking about the dishes right now, or is it actually a broader conversation about the burdens of housework? Or is it something broader about the amount of respect you've either been showing me or you've been communicating to me? And all of those are actually subtly different. And being able to have a moment where you say, we're not just opponents here, we're also lovers or partners or family members. So we're used to collaborating together. And before launching into the disagreement, saying, can we come to some agreement about what we're disagreeing about? I think that can help. It also helps show what you're not disagreeing about, right? So when you say, we're really just disagreeing about the different burdens that each of us have been shouldering in terms of housework, off the table is whether we love each other, or whether we're going to stay together, or whether we're committed to living together. And I think just viewing disagreement as something that we can shape, right? As something that we can design, as something we can divide. So we're doing this conversation today. We can talk about this other issue another day. That gives folks a bit more agency than they might feel in those kinds of disagreements.
Definitely. No, I think there's so much interesting stuff in there. And in particular, I loved your point that if there's a disagreement about the dishes, very often it speaks to a deeper, broader disagreement that's happening beneath the surface about I don't feel like this person is pulling their weight in terms of the housework, for example, or I don't feel like what I do is respected or appreciated by this person. And I mentioned that, I'm in a master's program right now, and I am hopefully going to become a therapist one day, in
Oh,
particular
wow.
for couples. And so this is very helpful for me, even thinking about how I will be addressing some of these topics in the future. We had we actually have a live comment from one of our viewers here. And I see Tony Zhang, who had the first question that I related to you. Tony, I do see your question. I'm gonna circle back to it. JM had an interesting comment here, and they say, this conversation reminded me of Adam Grant's Think Again. The book shared that rethinking rethinking debate and its central metaphor, where maybe we can think of debate rather than as like this combative thing, more as like a dance. Where JM says it can look like 2 steps backward, 1 step forward, and vice versa. And so I just, wondering what you think about JM's connection there to Adam Grant's work, where it's reframing the central metaphor around what debate is. How does that strike you?
I love that. And this book, Think Again, was very influential in the way in which I thought about my book. And Adam was one of the first that I've seen say, this community of debaters, they're doing something that other people can learn from. And in some ways, I kind of ran with that baton. I thought, I can talk to this community. I know this much for sure. What am I qualified to say anything about polarization and these things that we led with? And he helped me to make that mental jump of saying, make our contribution, right? It's not the full answer to the thing, but make a contribution. So I think the connection is certainly there in a biographical sense. In terms of how I think about the prompt specifically, I would say 2 things. I think one is, and Adam goes through lots of different ways in which you might be able to rethink your positions. The way in which I think about it most naturally is through a conversation. So one way to rethink your positions is to invite in another voice. And in particular, to invite in the voice of the challenger, the critic, the debater. And those are not the only voices that I think you need, but I think there is a particular kind of sharpness that comes with having to respond to someone who really disagrees with you, or who might actually dismantle your argument and you have to build it up again, and or who comes up with a really difficult counterexample that you have to make room for in the theory that you've built, and that usually requires making the idea more capacious, or more accommodating of paradoxes, of opposites, of contradictions. And so the approach to rethinking that I think debate takes is primarily one about inviting in the voice of someone who disagrees. And in terms of some of the imagery that you were using, Jeremy, there about or quoting about dance and give and take, all of those things are there. I think the one part that I would not shy away from is just collision.
Interesting.
And what happens when 2 ideas collide? More often than not, it actually ricochets into a 3rd direction. So I think one thing, you think something else, and we're talking it through, and it usually is that we've both missed something, right? And that exchange has filled out our understanding, but it's also often the case that it points to some kind of 3rd solution. And because you've laid out the inadequacy or incompleteness of both positions on their own. So I think there's a lot of things about the architecture of modern life, of even social etiquette, that we're not really meant to directly contradict one another. And even just kind of name calling or calling out seems to me evasive in a different way, because it's not really a collision of ideas. It's a kind of a characterization of the person. It's sometimes an abstraction. Like, you would say that you're a Democrat, right? That's not real collision. That's a kind of a, I don't know, you conjure up a hologram of who the person is and you talk to that instead. And so much of the architecture of communication, the choreography of day-to-day interactions, it's meant to avoid that. But I think there's something productive that comes from that exchange as well.
Definitely. And I love this notion that, coming for someone personally, like, oh, of course you'd say that you're a Democrat. Yeah. That can seem, in some sense is, I suppose, a more direct form of engagement. But I think your point is really interesting, that in a strange way, that actually is kind of evasion, right? Because you're not really you're not taking an honest look at what they just said and keeping your critique centered on that. You're sort of taking the focus elsewhere to who they are as a person. And I also wanted to ask about another thing that I often see in debate, which in my view is really counterproductive, but I find kind of fascinating, which is interrupting. And this is something that is possibly my single biggest pet peeve, like in life. It's like, because like when someone interrupts me, my understanding of that is like, I don't know what you're about to say, but it doesn't matter because what I have to say is more important. And to me, that just feels profoundly disrespectful. And so I really try to avoid doing it myself. I'm not always perfect. But I just wanted to ask you, like, why do we interrupt so much? And is it really ever a good idea?
Yeah, I think a lot about it because, and I even write about how it seems irrational in lots of ways. So when we interrupt, we clearly make the other side feel as though they haven't been heard, and the likelihood of persuasion goes way down, I think. We also could just get the argument wrong. We give them a chance to change their argument, so they move away from where we've interrupted. And maybe the best answer I've come to about why we do it is this point about spectacle again. The one common feature, I think, of bad arguments is we have the sense that the other side is talking past us to some imaginary audience, most of them who already agree with them, right? So that's what we do when we kind of put in like a sick burn or like a meme or like a, or a slogan, right? And it's kind of like a cultural reference. And often I'm an advisor to the undergraduates here, and so many of these memes come from TikTok, and so it just goes completely over my head. But you get a sense that what you thought was a private exchange or a real moment of connection between one person and another is being sorted or categorized or uploaded, I think might be the most precise term, into just this kind of broader cultural discourse where we have our different roles and spots. And I think interruption, it's rooted in an assertion of power sometimes over the other side, and the sense of the spectacle of it, that an inattentive audience member who's not really paying attention to the argument might see, oh, that person seems to be the more dominant person, the more confident person, which we should defer to them. Those instincts are, I think, always there, right? And all these ideas, I'm kind of glossing over, but each of them are important in their own right, I think. It takes something to be an attentive listener. And I think all of us are prone to deferring to the loudest voice in the room. It's like, this person seems like they know what they're doing, or it'll be too much trouble for us to stand up to them, as opposed to being attentive listeners. And some of those bullying tactics that we see on the political stage, that we see on cable television work because of the deference that we afford. So I think that is that gets at a part of why it happens. And in terms of how we get over it, I think another part of starting every disagreement with some amount of agreement is to say, not only agreement about what we're disagreeing about, but how we're going to have the exchange. And one of the things that debate gets really right, I think, is it says, I'm going to talk for a bit, you're going to talk, but I'm going to get a chance to respond to you separately. So I don't have to interrupt in the middle of it, right? And you also don't have to interrupt me because you're guaranteed time to be able to respond. And maybe most charitably, we interrupt when we feel like we're not going to have another chance. Right? And so laying out those ground rules in the beginning in a way that gives each of us a chance to be heard and to respond, I think that helps.
I think that's a great point, and really insightful that, you know, we interrupt when we feel like we may not have the chance to speak unless we do. And it strikes me that for this reason, interruptions can have this kind of snowballing effect, where if one person interrupts, that signals to the other person, okay, I better interrupt, otherwise I'm never going to get my turn to talk. And so I feel like some kind of agreement, whether that's implicit or ideally explicit, about like, hey, you know, I'm going to give you as much time as you need, you know, but then I want that time too. I think that's a really powerful idea. I wanted to switch to another question that we had from a member, Bo. William W. wrote in saying, I have found the ideas in this book very helpful, especially in the world of self-debate, which is perhaps another term for thinking itself. So, so when, you know, so I guess my question for you, Bo, would be like, do you implement the principles and ideas in this book, even just internally, when you're trying to figure out how you think or how you feel about a given issue? You know, do you kind of set up this debate within your own head, or is that kind of a separate process?
No, I really do. And I'm a recovering debater. So so it's still a big part of how I think. I think it's in two ways. One is that point about subjecting the ideas that I have to critique. I think that's a big part of it. And I have to think there are some limits to that. You know, it makes me slower. I think it makes me a slower thinker, because I am very used to the idea, or naturally given to the idea, that my voice won't be the only voice in a room, right? And in order for my voice to be, say, taken seriously, it has to connect in some ways with the people who are already there. And I think that comes biographically from the fact that, you know, a young person, a person who's moved around the country a lot, the room in some sense is not mine. You know, I'm often a visitor, I'm a newcomer. And so that sense of second guessing, I think, in a positive way, but in a way that does require a few more mental steps than if I were just fully persuaded of a position. I think that's one part of it. I think the second is in the process of building arguments. You know, I go through frameworks in the book, like the 4 W's, asking, what's the point I'm making? Why is it true? When has it happened before? Why should anybody care about it? That kind of organizing function, that those kinds of demands, to say, it's not enough for you to just have some inchoate feelings, try and organize it, make it in a way that other people might be able to understand. I think that's also a big part of how I naturally think. Again, there are limits to it. You know, there are times when that can take you away from just sitting in your emotions for a bit, or thinking that not all of your thoughts have to be digestible to the outside world.
Mhm.
And it's a problem journalists also have. It's a problem authors have. Obviously, they go to a party to be able to tell a story about the party.
Right, that's right.
But I feel that a lot, and someone was saying, I think maybe the line is Elizabeth Strout or someone like that. There you go, thinking like yourself again, and that's how I think.
Fair enough. Fair enough. And it was funny. I was just going to say that make the same comment about writers and authors and the struggle of making your own thoughts digestible and
Yeah,
understandable to others. As a writer myself, that's something that I can certainly relate to.
yeah.
We had a live comment here from another longtime member, Heather Hansen on Facebook says, loved this book. As a trial attorney, I can relate to
Wow.
so many of the ideas. Appreciate your input, Heather. So I don't want to take up too much more of your time, Bo. I'm thinking we go for another like 10, 15 minutes.
I'm here.
Is that
I'm
much
here
for
for
you?
as long as there are questions. I'm here.
Perfect. All right, let's go for another 10, 15 minutes then. We had another question from Pamela C. And Pamela says, most of the time I find that arguments drag on for a long time, for hours or even days.
Wow.
What is the best way to have an efficient argument such that both parties can move on? This does not mean to give up an argument, but to get the message across, regardless of whether the other party accepts it, whether there's agreement or not. So yeah, how can we? I know that's kind of what your whole book is about in a lot of ways, but yeah, any thoughts on that dilemma?
It's a brilliant question. A brilliant question, and I think it captures better than some of how I've explained of why it makes sense to invest the time in being deliberate about our disagreements, because
Mm,
it's right that having this conversation about what's our disagreement about, what's under the disagreement, as you were saying a second ago, Jeremy, of crafting arguments, of switching sides, these things all take time, but so do bad arguments, right?
right.
Bad arguments take weeks sometimes,
Yes.
and it takes time even when you're not with the other person, because you're thinking about the disagreement, or you're stewing or you're gossiping
Yeah.
about it to other people. And so I really believe where the question is coming from in terms of how you have efficient arguments. I think the that work of avoiding crosstalk by establishing what the disagreement is about is a big part of it. And
Mhm.
it often is the case that day 3 out of a 7-day argument is like, oh, now we figured out what the disagreement is about, right?
Yes.
And up until that time has been a lot of misunderstanding, bruising on either side, hurt
Mhm.
egos, so on. And I think that getting to that answer as quickly as possible saves a lot of time. And one of the things I talk about in the book is how the different kinds of disagreements we have: factual disagreements, normative disagreements, prescriptive disagreements, tend to coexist. And so
Mhm.
disentangling that, I think, can save a lot of time. The other suggestion that I would have is to come to some agreement about what it would take for the other person to become persuaded.
Interesting.
What it would take for them to fold,
Mhm.
essentially, right?
Mhm.
And it may actually be that the disagreement isn't one where the point is persuasion, and even saying that is helpful, just to say, look, all I want from this disagreement is to better understand where you're coming from. And that too helps rein in a little bit, because then you have an off ramp as soon
Right.
as you've started learning some information. But in the disagreements that I think tend to be hardest, which is one where you want to change someone's mind, you want to get on the table, what would it take for me to persuade you?
Mhm.
And vice versa, I think, is important too. Because one theme that I think runs through a lot of these questions about bad forms of disagreement, interrupting, ego-driven, so on, is there's a defensiveness that lies behind all of it, right? And I think one feature of a good disagreement is one where both sides could end up on the other side having changed their mind, right? And it does require that amount of vulnerability, because it suggests you're coming to it with your full person rather than just a little part that you're willing to show for the purposes of this disagreement. So coming to some agreement about what it would take, where the finish line is, I think that helps save time as well.
I love that. I think that's such an important point, that we often think to ourselves like, oh, how can I get through to this person? How can I, what would it take to convince? It's like, just ask them. You could literally just say, what would it take to convince you? And I think for me anyway, that I've actually done this, and it's been a really useful way for me to determine, is it even worth talking to this person? Because sometimes what they'll say is, like I remember on Facebook once, I was like, what I was having an online disagreement. That's a whole other thing, online disagreements. But I was talking to an old acquaintance of mine, and I was like, what would it take for me to convince you that this particular politician is not worth voting for? And they said, well, that politician would have to switch parties for me to not vote for them. And I said, okay, now I know this person is obviously not worth trying to convince, because they've set the bar in such a place where by definition I cannot reach that. I literally can't. I cannot make that happen. I can't make this person switch political parties.
No, I love that. And Jeremy, maybe just one footnote I'd add there is, most people are pretty reasonable, and there is something about the forcing mechanism of having to say what would persuade you that makes people moderate a little bit, right? So saying like, this person would have to completely change their personality, there's a shame that might come with that, and that I think forces a rethink on their end as well. And maybe just another point I'd add is, in addition to that standard of when you're going to change your mind, what it's going to take to change your mind, it helps to force the other side to articulate what their position is as well. So one of the things about the interrupter, I call this person the wrangler in the book, who just says no to all the ideas that you put forward, is, well, what are you proposing, right? Because it's not a fair disagreement if you can switch the goalposts conveniently while disagreeing with everything I'm saying, right? So if you are putting forward 10 ideas of where you could go on holidays and none of them are good enough for the other person, they're either saying you're going to stay on the couch and go nowhere, or they're suggesting destination number 11, right? And it's worth thinking about the pros and cons of destination 11 versus 1 through to 10. So even before we get to a position of the standard, we should get a position where both sides have some stakes in the disagreement. That's not just about tearing things down.
Again, I think that's a great point. I love that a lot. Since we only have about 5 minutes left, I wanted to ask about something that I think is on a lot of our minds right now, which is getting together with families for the holidays. It is not unusual at my family Christmas dinner table that something comes up, something that we disagree on. And I think there's something kind of inevitable about it, where you have people, different generations, different walks of life. They don't necessarily see each other every day. They're not used to each other's quirks of personality and opinion. And something just kind of sparks, and there's this disagreement that happens during what should otherwise, I think a lot of people wish would be just a very chill, peaceful, dinner conversation. Doesn't always happen that way. So for those of us who are looking back on our Thanksgiving dinners and also looking ahead to future holiday dinners within the next few weeks, what words of wisdom would you provide to people listening, just to have some better conversations with their loved ones?
It's a hard question. I mean, good luck is probably the best
And that's all the time we
answer.
have, everybody. Good luck. See ya.
But I think a lot of the broader points about family, about being deliberate in our conversation apply obviously to this context. One of the things I think about when I go to these gatherings is not everybody is in the mood for the kind of engagement that you want to have. So the thing that's problematic, one thing that's problematic about the very passionate uncle or aunt who just has some positions they want to like outline for everybody is, we want to eat or we want to do something else, and
Yes.
you want to do this other thing, right?
Yeah.
And the problematic thing about the niece or the nephew, this is a little stereotypical in terms of age, but I've seen it. The thing about that's problematic about the nephew or niece who starts lecturing the older family member is they don't want that. No, we also don't want this kind of exchange, right? Of like a teach-in happening at dinner. And so I think maybe the best thing I can say is you want to seek permission, not for your right to speak, right? And certainly not for the particular opinions you want to put forward. I think that's something that people should be able to do. But you want to seek permission for the kind of exchange you want to have at any given time. So you might say to an outspoken member of the family who starts talking about vaccine mandates or whatever issue is on the table, you might say, hey, this is actually an important issue for me. And I think, I could learn something or we could get somewhere by disagreeing about it. Do you mind if we argue about this for a little bit? Or do you mind if I give you some of the points that I have in opposition and hear what you have to say at the end of it? And so when we enter into a disagreement, I think we come with at least two things. We come with the positions that we hold, and we come with the mode of engagement that we want to talk to the other side in. And recognizing that the second is as potentially divisive, as substantive as the first, I think that can be helpful. And saying, and asking, the permission of that person, of the room. It may well be that you're not going to do it at the family table. You have to just get that person over dessert in the living room or something like that. Getting that permission, which is another way of saying getting that level of agreement, I think can be helpful.
I think that's a great idea. Yeah, it really comes down to, it sounds like, not just the content of what you're discussing, but the form that takes, and the where and the when. It's an intentionality, not just about the argument itself, but the context in which it occurs. And I think getting everyone on the same page about what they want and what they're okay with, I think is a great way to approach that. So since we're just about out of time, maybe just one last question for you, Bo.
Right.
Which is, thinking about the Next Big Idea Club audience in particular. I mean, this is a group of widely read individuals who love the world of big ideas, who love learning, who love having conversations about books and topics such as these. What advice would you give to our audience in particular about having good arguments, really? Because I feel like a lot of us in particular are open to changing our minds, and we are open to learning something new, but not everyone is, and so how do you think that our audience can help share that open-mindedness and have better arguments with the world?
It's a rich question. Two things come to mind. One is an essential lesson of debate is that being right and being persuasive are two different things. So, and I think it's in the way in which your community models itself already, but I'll just highlight it, is the aim, I think, of being in contact with good ideas is not just to possess the truth or to hold the truth, but to share it. And that requires a different skill set. So back to our conversation about loss, one of the things that cabins the loss of losing a disagreement for me is it's often a failure of persuasiveness rather than a failure of being correct. And that suggests there's something for me to continue working on in this craft. I think the second thing that I'll just highlight, and I hope it's the kind of book that enriches or deepens people's appreciation of other books, because there is substantive comment that I want to make, but I see the contribution more as a framework through which to view other ideas, other circumstances, other issues and problems that come up in one's day-to-day life. And when you look over the course of a catalog or a library of books that I'm sure people will accumulate over many months and years, there'll be disagreements between them. And viewing that cacophony as a source of strength, as a potentially additive thing rather than a subtraction. When there's disagreement, you have to choose one or the other. Being willing to say, and a little bit more. I had a creative writing teacher, Jamaica Kincaid, who
very jealous that she was your teacher.
Oh,
That's
I mean,
incredible.
I'm jealous of my past self. And she would, I think I'd written an essay or something like that, and she would go through all the buts and say this could just as easily be an and I think that taught me something very important. And so viewing those sources of disagreement and conflicts as something that can be additive, saying, as I take the central thesis of the book to be, that the opposite of bad disagreement is not agreement, but is good disagreement. How we write towards that, read towards that, work towards that in our day-to-day lives is something that I hope people consider, and is something that I wrestle with most days.
I love that. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. So everyone, as you know, the book is Good Arguments. If you haven't finished it yet, please do. I have a feeling you're going to love the whole thing. If you have more questions for Bo, feel free to post them in our Facebook group. But I think that's all for today. So Bo Seo, thank you so much, man.
I enjoyed it. Thanks so much, Jeremy. Thanks to your team, and thank you to your community. I really appreciated the very thoughtful questions.
Of course. Glad you had a good time. I did too. See ya.
Bye.